Right, we come now to item 5, and I think Sandra advises me that we have a record number of applications for public input, and the first item for public input is a request from the Screen Industry Sites of Significance Working Group. But on advice, I've declined that under Standing Order 7.7.4a on the basis that this is a matter that has already been considered and decided. The other 7 requests all relate to the notice of motion from Councillor Bartley that's before us today. All 7 public inputs are in support of the notice of motion. 2 aren't able to be with us, and I'll have a motion to, in due course, to table the submission that we have from one of those 2 submitters. There are 4 petitioners who will, thankfully, from the point of view of making this a more coherent process, present jointly. Those are the Counties Manukau District Health Board, Luisa Sailailai, Alcohol Health Watch, Dr. Nikki Jackson, Auckland Regional Public Health Service, Dr. Nick Eichler, and the Salvation Army, Ana Ika. So they will present a single presentation encapsulating their shared views, and then we'll have questions, and then the final public input will be from Chloe Swarbrick MP, who is the sponsor of the legislation before Parliament, or to be drawn from the members' ballot to go into Parliament in due course, which our notice of motion is in support of. So we'll take Chloe separately and questions to Chloe separately. But can I now welcome our 4 joint submitters for their presentation, and I'm not quite sure who's leading that off. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves, and then we look forward to hearing your petition. I think, not petition, submission. I think that will take just over 10 minutes, and then we'll have a period of time for questions. So over to the submitters, please.
Good morning, Mayor and councillors. I'm just waiting for my colleagues to, so I can see that they're present.
I'm here. Louise is here.
Yeah, Nick.
Great. Nick, would you like to commence?
Sure thing. Tēnā koutou katoa. Nick Eichler toku ingoa. I'm one of the medical officers of health for the Auckland region at Auckland Regional Public Health Service. You may have heard of us recently from our work in COVID-19, but we work across the entirety of the Auckland region in many different public health functions, and I have particularly the portfolio responsibility for both tobacco and alcohol harm minimisation.
Anna there?
Good morning, everybody. Malolele, my name is Ana Ika. I'm a social policy advocate and analyst with the Salvation Army Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit. And so we're here to support the notice of motion on behalf of the Salvation Army.
Talafalava, my name is Louisa Sailailai. I'm the Program Manager for the Alcohol Harm Minimisation Program at Counties Manukau Health. I'm speaking on behalf of Counties Manukau Health today. Thank you for your time.
And Morena koutou, I'm Dr. Nikki Jackson, the Director of Alcohol Health Watch. We're all in support of the motion that's put to you today. Next slide, please. I'm going to give a snapshot of alcohol use across Tamaki Makaurau. When we look among drinkers in this region, across the 3 DHBs, we can see more than 1 in 4 to almost 1 in 3 male drinkers are hazardous drinkers. That's a pattern of drinking that increases the risk of both physical and mental health harm to the drinker and to others. But you can see there's significant inequities by ethnicity, high levels of hazardous drinking among Māori men drinkers, Pacific men drinkers, and also European men drinkers. And inequities by deprivation, with those living in the most deprived neighbourhoods much more likely to be hazardous drinkers. Next slide, please. Among female drinkers, although male drinkers are more likely to drink hazardously, we almost have 1 in 5 female drinkers drinking hazardously across the region. Again, we see significant inequities by ethnicity, with Wahine Māori more likely to report hazardous drinking, high among Pacific women and European and other women drinkers. And again, significant inequities by level of deprivation. Next slide, please.
This is a snapshot of alcohol harm in Tamaki Makaurau looking at health. So in 2018, when you combine the amount of alcohol-related presentations to both Auckland City and Middlemore hospitals, there's nearly 10,000 presentations in that year. That's about 200 a week, with the weekends carrying the burden of those presentations. They look like family harm, they look like mistreatment of children, suicide and mental health concerns, road accidents, chronic conditions like cancers and heart disease, and also, of course, to significant others in unborn children in whānau through fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Just noticing the cost there to Middlemore, about 15 million to 26 million a year, but also noting on an individual level, the harms for our ED staff navigating some of those intoxication cases through abuse and disturbances to the space. Next slide, please.
The Salvation Army's mission is to care for people, transform lives and reform society by God's power. Our church and combined social services serve over 30,000 individuals and families in Auckland. Our social services include addiction treatment for alcohol, other drugs and gambling. We also have food banks, supportive accommodation, social and transitional housing, to name a few. Many of our families that come through our doors often present with issues such as family violence, which Louisa mentioned, family violence, debt and financial hardship, homelessness, and food insecurity. But the underlying issue for majority of our clients is often related indirectly or directly to alcohol harm. And so the Salvation Army on a daily basis sees the detrimental harm of alcohol to the families that we support and care for. Some of the key drivers that we believe to this alcohol harm that can be addressed is affordability, availability and exposure. According to Alcohol Health Watch research, the standard alcohol drink in Auckland was 77 cents. And so that's a lot cheaper than the price of a bottle of water. 80% of alcohol is now sold at off-licensed stores, and there is excessive exposure to alcohol through advertising and sponsorship. Disproportionately, these key drivers are exponentially in our poorest communities, like the communities that the Salvation Army serves. For our tangata whai ora that come out of our treatment services and also come out of our supportive accommodation and return to their communities, there's a proliferation of these key drivers, and this doesn't support their road to recovery or to sobriety. Next slide, please. The members' bill that we're in support of today addresses two of the key drivers we mentioned, which is availability and exposure. The bill seeks to remove the appeal of the local alcohol policies. And in 2014, the Salvation Army made a submission in support of Auckland's LEP draft. It's now 2022. Given the current economic climate that we're in and the impacts of COVID-19, we believe inequalities will continue to increase, and this will disproportionately impact the families that we serve here at the Salvation Army. We believe that the hardships that our families serve will be perpetuated. In our COVID-19 impact dashboards, we highlighted that these hardships can predispose our families to alcohol harm. And so that's quite concerning. So LEP for Auckland is not only overdue, but is very much needed. This bill can address LEPs, which Nick will talk about later. The bill also looks at strengthening the GLC's criteria to look at license applications and address the exposure of alcohol sponsorship in broadcast sport. Research already shows that alcohol advertising disproportionately impacts young people, and in our State of the Nation report released last month showed that hazardous drinking impacts young Māori and young Pacific families. The Salvation Army, along with many other community organisations, is often the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, but we believe there needs to be implementations of barriers and safeguards on top of the cliff to prevent our families from tipping over. And we believe this private member bill is one of those safeguards. And so we support it, and we encourage the Auckland Council to also support these safeguards in preventing our families from tipping over when it comes to alcohol harm. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'll just cover a little bit about the local alcohol policies part of this proposed amendment bill. I mean, as you'll be aware, Auckland Regional Public Health Service has been walking down this very long road with Auckland Council for a very, very long time. It's been 2,500 days since you first released your provisional local alcohol policy back in May. The idea of the 2012 reforms and the creation of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act was to give communities input into the alcohol that's available in their local communities. The intent of the Act was to achieve this through two major mechanisms, one being the local alcohol policy and the democratic and consultative processes that we have to go through and that are set out in the Act to get public input and to give some local autonomous control. The other one was the extended criteria for that district licensing committees have to take into account when they're making a decision on an individual license application that comes before them in section 105, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. So yeah, it's been a very long road. If we go to the next slide, this is a brief vectorial summary of the long process, the long and winding road that we've been sort of taken on by a lot of the people that have been appealing this process. So, and this only gets us up to the 8th of June through all of the various forums at the licensing authority and all of the appeals that have come in, largely from the supermarket duopoly, who enjoy a great amount of income from their continued ability to keep selling without at particular times of day and in places without the local alcohol policy in place. We have been to the Court of Appeal, which found largely in Auckland Council and Auckland Regional Public Health Service's favour. And again, the tactic of the supermarkets is to delay, going as far as to lodge request to be heard at the Supreme Court, and at this stage we're waiting for the Supreme Court's decision on whether they're going to hear that case. If they say no, then there is still some process to go back to ALA to actually get this provisional policy approved. If the Supreme Court hears it, it's going to be years more. This is an incredible ROI for the people, the companies in the industry that are appealing the plan, because they're paying for the lawyers, and every day, and it's not that much, and every day that this is delayed, there's a lot of sales of alcohol happening. If we go to the next slide.
And you know, what's happening in Auckland is also happening around the rest of the country. So you know, it's 8 years past the regulations for local alcohol policies, and although 41 of the 67 councils have a local alcohol policy in place, that only represents 35% of the population, because there's no local alcohol policy in Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington and Christchurch. And as Nick said, it's clear that the supermarkets have appealed 86% of the first local alcohol policies. The bottle stores have appealed 72%. And once it's got into the appeals process, it's really watered down the effectiveness of the policies, which, you know, it's amazing to think that Auckland is still in its first local alcohol policy, and 9 councils are already in their second local alcohol policy, having reviewed their first. Next slide, please. And, you know, this notice of motion today in the private members bill reflects wide support across local government in New Zealand in 2018, when 95% of the sector supported the local government remit to amend the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act so that LAPs can more accurately reflect community views. Next slide, please. So without a local alcohol policy, communities have to be burdened with objecting to individual licence applications, which is totally unfair. We had a promise in the reform bill that licences would become harder to get and easier to lose, and that just hasn't been realised. If we look at the 2 annual reports of the last 2 years from the Auckland District Licensing Committee, you can see that between 0 and 2 new on licences or off licences were refused per year. And if you combine all licence renewals together, you know, around 1 to 4 licences refused. So certainly that just hasn't been realised, that licences have been harder to get. Next slide, please.
In regards to alcohol availability, there's a strong community concern about their environment. In Counties Manukau Health, as part of our work, we've been asking our community via social media what they think about alcohol in their environment. We really want to privilege the community voice here. So the quotes are a couple of snapshots taken from a handful of interviews that we had with community members in South Auckland. They were asked, what do you think could be done to reduce alcohol-related harms for you, your family, and your community? For me, basically stop opening liquor stores. Personally, I think it comes down to accessibility. I live in South Auckland, a lesser closing time, maybe 9 o'clock, not so many licenses given out. And finally, I know it's going to be hard for our bottle store owners. I'm not worrying about their pockets, I'm worrying about our community. The community cares about the environment that they live in, and they want to be better heard on these issues, as we'll see next. Next slide, please.
So as one of the 3 agencies that's involved in the licensing process, Auckland Regional Public Health has been to a lot of DLCs and been involved in a lot of license applications. Some of our major concerns with the way that this happens at the moment is primarily that there is absolutely no mechanism within the legislation to give effect to Te Reo Waitangi. The piece of legislation is lacking any sort of clause that requires any of the application process to give effect to the treaty, as would be standard in lots of other pieces of legislation, including the RMA. The community participation for licensing is really difficult. The hearings are 1 to 2 full days. They don't give agendas. They don't necessarily allocate speaking times for public objectors. So people have to turn up to the council hall in Papatoetoe or in Manukau and take the whole day off work, sit there, not even know when they're going to be called on to speak. And up until recently, there hasn't been an opportunity for using video conferencing, for making this an accessible process. And then if you do turn up, quite often the applicants have hired specialist lawyers from top-tier law firms whose job it is to grill these people to try and discredit their particular concerns about a particular bottle store opening. So it's a really unpleasant and inaccessible process. I think that the access to justice and to people being heard is very poor. And if you don't show up, then the oppositions are largely ignored, even if there's extensive written evidence. I was at a meeting of DLC chairs just a few days ago where they confirmed this to me, that they put very little weight unless someone turns up. But it is so difficult to turn up, and it's such an unpleasant experience for a community member who just doesn't want an additional bottle store in their community, that it's hardly surprising that that people don't hear up, and then the community voice is excluded. From our experience of DLCs, as you saw, very few licenses are opposed, and even the ones that are opposed, which is only about 1% that go to DLCs, 86% of these are granted. So this is despite opposition from one of the specialist agencies, the police, the licensing inspector, or public health, who are raising significant concerns about an application going through. So we find that it's even when specialist expert agencies are brought in, and even when there's significant community opposition, it's still very difficult to have an application refused. If we go to the next slide, and one of the major reasons for this is that really, the DLCs tend to focus on the application that's in front of them. They take a very narrow interpretation of the legislative remit, and they really only look at the particular application in terms of very narrow criteria of suitability. Is this person applying for a license a suitable person? Have they in particular had any criminal convictions or have any record of this? But there's very little consideration of the wider context of the harm and the availability. We've only really been seeing any success in making arguments about this community already is saturated in alcohol and is already experiencing high levels of harm in the most deprived and the places with the highest density of outlets. So a recent hearing that I went to that was actually turned down, we had to talk about the fact that there were already 18 off licenses in a 1 kilometre radius from Papatoetoe. That this additional bottle store, I think it was the 3rd or 4th in the Papatoetoe town centre, just wasn't required. The process should be aimed at preventing harm, not just limiting the harm that already exists or preventing an exacerbation of it. The additional Section 105 considerations that are proposed in this bill would give an avenue to do that. They would require DLCs to look and see in the wider context whether there's already a sufficient amount of alcohol in this community, and also to take into account the harm and the statistics that we bring and the police bring to the DLC, and apply that sort of understanding of the broader context to this application, rather than taking a very narrow interpretation and asking whether this particular bottle store will cause harm, because that just isn't the way that the harm works, and it isn't the way that public health works. If we go to the next slide.
Moving on from licensing and into the alcohol sports sponsorship space, like many of us here in Aotearoa, our tamariki, rangatahi and whānau absolutely adore participating in sports, watching every game, celebrating every win of their favourite team and players. But these people are heroes to our children and to our young people, but it can come at significant costs. Many of our elite teams and competitions in rugby, cricket, golf and netball are sponsored by the alcohol companies. Branding is all over the uniforms, goalposts, around the sports grounds and extended into their social media. The teams we adore are walking signposts for alcohol, and our kids see this. Moving on to the next slide, we can see a beautiful quote here from a South Auckland member involved in our project. What they had to say was, yeah, sports and alcohol go hand in hand. Oh, I'm going to watch the game tonight. I'm going to have a beer. Game's on, beer's on. It just becomes a norm. And I don't really believe it is the norm. I don't believe it doesn't have to be the norm. Please go to the next slide.
And so we've got lots of time for questions. I'll just run through this slide. But I just want to say that this private members bill actually supports the work that Auckland Council have already done. In 2018, Auckland Transport prohibited all alcohol advertising on public transport vehicles and infrastructure. So this is really just extending that to support others in the sports arena. And this year, Super Rugby women's teams committed to not using alcohol branding as well. We did it with tobacco, we can do it with alcohol. There's a number of reviews from the government commission bodies that recommend an end to alcohol sports sponsorship. But let's see this as one important step towards comprehensive restrictions to alcohol advertising and promotion. Next slide, please. And finally, we have lots of public support. There is strong, this is independent polling from UMR last month in February among Aucklanders, strong support for government taking stronger action on alcohol, stronger support for children not being exposed to alcohol advertising, strong support for getting rid of alcohol sports sponsorship, and also strong support for the alcohol industry not being involved in developing local or national government policies in relation to alcohol. Next slide, please.
In our most recent survey at counties, we also saw that 89% of our respondents supported a full review of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act. In our interviews, we also talked a little bit about the amendment bill, and here's what they had to say. First part of Chloe's bill, completely in support of. Communities must have the right to oppose developments that they see as harmful. Take that away is fundamental. That's my biggest criticism of stopping people saying from what they want. They're local, and that's extremely dangerous. And finally, I definitely support that one. The submission process, definitely support that. Sense of sport, yeah, I definitely support that one. Only because for that one, for Polynesian people, that is basically what we do, sports. And so for me, if you find something, or you equate that, I enjoy this, so then I must enjoy that, that goes hand in hand. This is our next slide, is our final slide. It is our shared vision to see our unborn babies, tamariki, rangatahi and whānau, growing up in an environment free from the harms of alcohol. We ask that the governing body support all four motions and continue to show strong leadership in contributing to our shared vision. Together, on behalf of my colleagues and respective organisations, thank you so much to the governing body for the privilege for expressing our strong support for this amendment bill.
Thank you very much. That's been a very clear and coherent presentation. I've just got an initial couple of quick questions. One, you started off on the first slide talking about hazardous drinkers, and I was keen to know what the definition of hazardous drinkers were. And the second question, it might go to Nick. I've from time to time gone down to emergency departments on the weekend, and there's generally a very high percentage of people presenting with alcohol-related illness or injuries. Have you got any up-to-date figures on the number of people typically on a Friday or a Saturday night in any one of our hospital emergency departments that would be there for alcohol-related reasons? So those two questions, I leave it up to you as to who might want to answer those.
Sure, I'll answer the hazardous drinking question. So the New Zealand Health Survey uses the World Health Organization classification of hazardous drinker, which is a 10-question questionnaire, and you score 8 or more to become a hazardous drinker. So it indicates generally a pattern of drinking high amounts of alcohol on a regular basis that gives rise to hazardous drinking. We know that a similar proportion would say drink 6 drinks or more on an occasion at least once a month.
Thank you. And the second question, ED departments. Anybody able to help with that?
Yeah, so the Australasian College for Emergency Medicine has done surveys on this, and they have shown that 16% of all ED patients, if you're there on a Saturday morning, are there for alcohol. Saturday and Friday, well, Saturday and Sunday mornings in the early hours are peak emergency department times, but it's really a sort of tip of the iceberg, the very obvious stuff. Alcohol is a class 1 carcinogen. It contributes to numerous different cancers. It causes heart attacks, it causes stroke, it causes chronic liver disease, it causes extreme amounts of mental distress and depression and anxiety and suicide. It's a contributing factor to a very high proportion of completed suicides. So we can't just talk about EDs and that very obvious stuff. There's this huge bottom of the iceberg sitting under the water. And in addition, we've just had the Waitangi Tribunal hearings on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, where it's not certain what the proportion of people affected in New Zealand are, because we've never properly resourced a prevalence survey. But similar places like Canada have done this and estimate that even up to sort of 3 to 5% of the entire population is affected, and these are lifelong, potential limiting brain injuries that come with incredible amounts of cost and incredible amounts of effort on the parts of carers and health system and justice systems.
Thank you very much for that. Now, next question is Councillor Kathy Casey.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And my question relates to the causal effect between alcohol advertising and drinking among young people. And I'd just like to refer to 2 studies. And thank you, Josephine Bartley, Councillor, for bringing this before us. This is exactly what Auckland Council should be doing, advocating for the minimisation of harm from alcohol. But the 2 studies that Josephine Bartley mentions in her notice of motion, and we have heard through the regulatory committee that had a huge impact on me, is what I'd like to hear about too. One was that 90% of bottle stores in my ward, Albert Eden Puki Tāpapa and Otara Papatoetoe, 90% of them infringed our signs bylaw. and 70% had 2 or more infringements. So that's one study that had me gobsmacked. But the other was another one, very recent, where children from age 11 to 13 were found to be exposed to advertising about alcohol about 4 or 5 times a day, and that the bulk of that, or at least 35% of that, came from sports and 25% from merchandise and other from sports venues. So it all ties into this bill that Chloe's put forward. So I'm interested just in a bit of the causal relationship between all of this and young people that can be set in the path to drinking hard.
Yeah. I'm happy to answer that. So when we look at really high quality studies, so longitudinal designs that follow people over time, that they haven't started drinking or they haven't started drinking heavily and they're exposed to advertising, what the studies show is that increased exposure to advertising increases the likelihood of starting to drink earlier and then starting to drink more heavily. And so they've actually concluded now, using a bunch of criteria, that alcohol advertising is a causal factor in youth drinking. Now, this is a real problem because 50% of alcohol abuse and disorder cases in New Zealand are developed by the age of 20. So this is a really vulnerable period to, we're trying to reduce alcohol addiction in this country. One of the key things we can turn down is the advertising and promotion.
Thank you.
I might just add there, Councillor, that you may be misremembering some of the statistics because it was 100% of bottle stores.
Whoa!
In Auckland Regional Public Health Services South Auckland survey that were non-compliant with the signage bylaw.
Whoa.
And essentially every one of those bottle stores is an enormous billboard for alcohol, for cheap alcohol.
Great.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you very much for that. Look, that's been a very clear and persuasive presentation. I suspect that you may be preaching to the converted here, so I wasn't expecting a large number of questions, but I think your presentation was really helpful in the discussion that we'll shortly have. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to now move to Member of Parliament for our Auckland Central area, Chloe Swarbrick. Welcome, Chloe. I hope the COVID is not treating you too badly, and I equally hope that I had no part to play in your contracting it. If we give you about 5 minutes and then open it up for questions, and just saying by way of a forward that the very first bill I ever put into the ballot in Parliament 41 years ago was to try to ban alcohol advertising. So there you go, 41 years and we're still trying. Chloe, welcome along today.
Kia ora. I love that as an opening gambit. Tēnā koe mea gof, tēnā koutou councillors, me mihi ka tika ki te mana whenua ki ana te whātua o Ōrākei no Inarangi no te mana hoki o ku tipuna. E whānau mai ahau e Tamaki Makaurau a tipu ake ahau e reira. No reira, Chloe Swarbrick, tēnei e mihi atu ana kia koutou katoa. Thank you for having me. Well, barely a day goes by that we don't hear about alcohol harm in our communities, but years have gone by without meaningful political action. And Phil, that's probably about 40 odd years now. I want to thank the community experts and the health professionals for their incredibly detailed and evidence-based submission before me, but also for their continued advocacy in the face of a huge amount of lobbying power. Now, you'll all know that there are 2 major types of parliamentary bills that dominate parliamentary process. There are government bills, which are proposed by members or ministers in cabinet rather, which take up the majority of House and Select Committee time. Members' bills are the other, which get heard one day every fortnight after being pulled from the luck of the biscuit tin. You'll likely be aware that Minister Farfoy intends to review the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act in this term of Parliament. This could hopefully results in a government bill to reduce alcohol harm. However, we do not yet have any guarantee of action from this eventual review, nor do we have a timeline. In fact, unfortunately, we are swimming in reviews. In 2010, the Law Commission recommended a suite of changes to alcohol laws, including ending advertising outright. In 2014, under the former national government, a ministerial forum led by Sir Graham Lowe recommended ending alcohol sponsorship and advertising in sport. In the last term of Parliament, the government commissioned Te Aotearoa, the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry, and Turuki, the Safe and Effective Justice Review. Recommendation 26 of the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry recommended, and I quote, take a stricter regulatory approach to the sale and supply of alcohol, informed by the recommendations from the 2010 Law Commission Review, the 2014 Ministerial Forum on Alcohol, Advertising and Sponsorship, and the 2014 Ministry of Justice Report on Alcohol Pricing. The Safe and Effective Justice Review echoed exactly those same sentiments, stating, and I quote, "We recommend stronger regulation of alcohol. Over recent decades, governments have ignored many recommendations aimed at reducing the harm and impact of alcohol misuse. Whiara Oranga, the 2010 Law Commission Review, Alcohol in Our Lives, the 2014 Ministerial Forum of Alcohol Pricing, all recommended our provided evidence for a stronger regulatory approach to the sale and supply of alcohol. Bolder political leadership is required here to take action now." You can see all of this is incredibly self-referential and circular because we have had a lot of reviews. This is an opportunity for action with an already drafted bill ready to have its day in Parliament. In this term of Parliament, standing orders were changed, and this is really important with regard to the motion, which means that members' bills no longer have to rely on the luck of the ballot drawer. They can, if they get the support of 61 non-executive members of Parliament, bypass the ballot to get to the debating floor. That is why I'm asking for your support as the largest council in this country with substantial experience in especially the failings on special appeals. If we can get the signatures and support of 61 non-executive, that is not ministers or undersecretaries, MPs across the House, we can get this bill into the debating chamber and no longer leave progress on this critical issue to chance. As councillors, you know this problem intimately. You've seen it in your communities, but you also know it because of the cost and the waste of time for council. Council has spent over $1 million and 7 years trying to finalise its own local alcohol policy. The removal of special appeals processes will allow communities to make their own rules about where and how alcohol is sold. I think that's basic democracy. The other half of this bill seeks to sever the tie between sports and alcohol, implementing recommendations from reviews that we have seen languishing since the early 2010s. As Dr. Nikki Jackson has shown, there is overwhelming public support to just do it. I could say a lot more, but I'm aware of my time limit, so I'll leave it with this final point that too often local government is the recipient of law from central government that is just frankly totally unworkable. On the issue of alcohol harm, my members' bill seeks to give power back to fix this. I am hopeful that it has your support so that we can end the parliamentary logjam and finally do something that works. I want to thank in particular Councillor Bartley and the council officials who I know have been working hard on this motion behind the scenes, as well as Councillor Collins for his seconding the motion, and hopefully all of council for your support.
Thank you very much, Chloe. You packed a lot into that period of time. I have a question, first question in the name of Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Excuse me, and thank you, Chloe. I chaired the Auckland LAP hearings panel when we did it a lifetime ago. It felt like we had 10,000 submissions. We did a good process. We came up with a fairly good result that was balanced, and yet we've gone through this ridiculous $1 million appeals process, which is the law is not fit for purpose. So I'm supporting you and your bill. The question I have though is as far as the decoupling of alcohol sponsorship of sports. And do you have a number, a modern number? Because I got an old number, but a modern number of what that actual quantum is?
Yeah, so unfortunately the most recent quantification that we have is from that 2014 Ministerial Forum, and it was approximated at around 21 million, but we know that at that point in time around 75% of those funds were going to rugby union in particular. With regard to how we could alternatively fund that, there actually is currently a lever inside of excise taxes, so the government could very easily recycle that back into kind of filling that gap. The other would be, of course, just to front up with a pot of money. However, we did hear really similar concerns about kind of the removal of funds when we sought to do exactly the same thing with ending tobacco advertising in the 90s. However, we saw quite quickly that there was a flood of other alternatives that came in to support sports.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted the councils to hear that the money, the sum of money we talk about here is not that large in the scheme of things compared to the harm that's caused. So thank you.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Good question. Thank you very much. Next question, Councillor John Watson.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. And I think Chloe's really answered my question. I guess just in terms of that historic figure, I think of 21 million, at the local level, certainly there used to be pretty extensive, liquor advertising at clubs for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the kind of decline in local sport, certainly in codes like rugby and with the advent of Super 15 and all the rest of it. That's been withdrawn, over the last couple of decades. So I'm just curious to know if that advertising we're talking about is really on the big national and provincial level, because I don't think there's too much around at local level, certainly not in relation to what it was in years gone by.
Kia ora, Councillor. Yeah, it definitely is the case that that figure encompasses all advertising and sponsorship at both a local and a national level. But as you well point out, alongside that withdrawal of kind of support for grassroots codes, there also has been a number of codes, including in professional kind of televised sports, that have shown that leadership, as was evidenced by the submission before mine. I'd also say that we're behind the 8 ball on this one. So for many years, France and Norway have prohibited sports sponsorship by alcohol companies, and in 2018 Ireland started that as well. Western Australia has also been looking at doing exactly this too.
Thank you very much. And the last question I have in front of me is from Councillor Chris Darby.
Thank you, Mayor. Kia ora, Chloe. Thank you for this. I commend the bill. Just a quick one for you, Chloe. In terms of this, I think it's the A Roman 2, winding down advertising and sponsorship of sports. Can you just explain why that doesn't go further to cultural events? And I'm mindful of places of congregation where young people are exposed to, advertising from, your Heinekens and Coronas, etc., being at the raft of cultural events that happen in Tamaki Makaurau and throughout New Zealand. For example, Splore's major sponsor is Corona. And then, of course, we come to some of our own theatres, where on the programs of maybe the opera or maybe it's the Auckland Theatre Company, the bottles of champagne are advertised, all exposing, young people to those products. So can you just explain why hasn't it, and there could be good reason why you haven't extended past sports into events as I've outlined? Cheers.
Yeah, kia ora, Councillor. In a nutshell, I would love to have done that. It is unfortunately the case that a members' bill has to take a relatively specific, defined, discrete area and try and push ahead with doing exactly that. So, we know that advertising, sponsorship and exposure normalises and glamorises a substance. It's why we chose to end tobacco advertising and sponsorship in the 90s. It's also why, I might add, on another controversial piece of legislation that was before all of us in the last election, with the proposed regulation of potential cannabis, we were also prohibiting the advertising and the sponsorship, because we know that normalising and glamorising through those processes is not the way that you reduce harm. So in a perfect world, I would love to be progressing a bill, as it seems that the Mayor did back in the day, to end advertising and sponsorship outright of alcohol, given that, this is not talking about people who want to drink at the end of the day or whatever else being prohibited from doing that, but from the processes of normalising and glamorising that substance. It is, however, unfortunately the case that with a members' bill, you've only got to bite off as much as you can chew. So to that effect, I've chosen those 2 key areas of ending the special appeals process to LAPs, given the pain that it has caused in Auckland and in councils across the country, but also to implement those really straightforward recommendations of the 2014 Ministerial Forum.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and thank you for, again, a very clear and coherent presentation to councillors today. I'm going to ask councillors Josephine Bartley and councillors Efeso Collins to move and second a motion of thanks for Louisa, Nikki, Nick, Anna and Chloe. So if both councillors are happy to do that, which I presume they are. Yep. I'll put the motion of thanks. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I declare that carried, and once again thank the presenters for some really good presentations. I have one other motion on screen. I mentioned earlier that two people who wanted to submit weren't able to make it today. That was Steve Randerson from Kayard and James Yallop from Whakahi, Waipiro. And James has tabled a public input, or has sent us a public input that we will table. And the second motion, I'll ask the same councillors if they can to move this motion, that we note the tabled public input from Whakahi, Waipiro. Happy to do that, councillors? Yep.
Happy to second.
All those in favour, please say aye.
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 To the contrary, no. I declare that carried. Thanks, councillors. We come now to item